Hello and welcome to The Game Changers. I'm Sue Anstiss, and this is the podcast where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport who are literally knocking down barriers and challenging the status quo for women and girls everywhere. A massive thank you to Barclays for once again sponsoring this series of The Game Changers. Few brands have done more for women's sport. Barclays are a title sponsor of the Women's Super League, and they're also backing the FA in the fantastic work it does to ensure that every schoolgirl across the country has the chance to play football by 2024. My guest today is Dawn Scott. Dawn is Senior Physical Performance Manager for the England women's team, as well as a technical advisor for FIFA and part of the Fitness Advisory Group for UEFA. Dawn worked with the US national women's team for 10 years and was part of the support team in their 2 World Cup wins in 2015 and 2019. I started by asking Dawn to tell us about her slightly unconventional route into sports science.
Towards the end of school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Looking at people working in sport back then, it wasn't really something where I looked at it and thought, I want to work in sport. So I really enjoyed physics. So I was like, maybe I want to do a physics degree. And I ended up going to Nottingham University to do physics. So I did my first year, fine, passed. Second year, started it, was sat in a module that you had to choose, and it was astronomy. And at the time I was sat there and I sat around very, very intelligent people, way smarter than me in terms of physics in that field. And I remember sitting there just thinking, I'm not sure where I'm going to go with this field. So kind of went home and I just said, Dad, I'm really not sure about this. I think I want to change and do something else. So, I think I'm going to kind of leave university and look for a different course. Dad and family were very supportive. I then ended up working for a year, and then I was still that maths kind of route and not really sports science. Accountancy sounds great. So start an accountancy degree at Sheffield Hallam University. I have to admit with that one, some of the classes clash with football practice. So probably missed some of the classes, and also it was kind of, economics and law, and that was not the science, the maths bits I thought. So again, at the end of that year, Dad, not sure I want to continue. I'm not sure that's where I want to go. And about then, it was like I started looking at sports science and found sports science courses at Crewe and Alsager, which is now Manchester Metropolitan University. Again, I think it was I was like, oh, wow, you can do sports science at university. It wasn't something, because this was now 1993. So again, it was, Dad, I'm going to exchange. I'm going to go here and I'm going to, see this one out. And this is where I do want to be. So did sports science degree at Manchester Metropolitan University. Really enjoyed that. And then the last year at university, kind of me and a couple of friends were like, what are we going to do next? What job opportunities are out there? Wasn't really much in the applied sports science field. We were like, we're not really sure where this degree takes us. We walked past literally a notice board and it said funded masters in sports nutrition at Aberdeen University. Let's do it. So it was a brand new course. I think there was 5 of us on a nutrition masters and then 3 of us actually on the sports nutrition. So did that for the year, and actually throughout the year, I kind of did a part-time teaching job at Aberdeen College. Again, started looking for jobs, and an election opportunity came up at Worcester. Worked there, really enjoyed that. And then with a colleague there, we started developing some kind of applied sports modules. So there was a sports nutrition, a training demands to really look at the impact on performance. So really enjoyed that. When I was there, I was actually working with somebody who was married to somebody who worked at the FA, and she's like, my husband said they're going to be recruiting. They want to extend sports science provision to the women's teams. When I was at Worcester, there was 2 or 3 of us who had a real interest in sports science and the women's game and women's football. So we actually spent 3-4 month period where we would travel on the road out to the women's Premier teams at the time, like Southampton Saints was one. We'd go to Doncaster Bells, Leeds United, and we'd go and fitness test the players. We'd give them feedback. And then myself and Mark Todd, we actually went out to Sydney and presented some of the research back. I also at the time, and she's reminded me of it since then, wrote to Hope Powell a few times. I'm doing this studies, are you interested in hearing more? And then when the job came up at the FA, I applied, and I was fortunate, I feel like, to get the role. And Hope kind of always told me afterwards that she was sick of me writing to her asking about jobs. So she's like, "Oh my goodness, I'm just going to appoint her." So yeah, so that was kind of my path into applied work in football.
It's a great lesson, isn't it, for young people now who aren't sure of their pathway in terms of, I guess, perhaps not quite so much experimentation, but finding your way and also persistence. The kind of got you through the door in the end with the FA, but going after something that you wanted clearly.
Definitely, because I think it's sometimes I looked at it and thought, my goodness, I'm a failure because from the outset I didn't have one thing and go after it. It's just funny sometimes how things work out and you pick up other maybe skills that you maybe wouldn't have if you hadn't have gone down that path.
Yeah. I believe one of the US players described you as the secret to everything. So, for people who don't know the scope of work of a sports scientist with elite teams, can you perhaps just explain the role and what sits within that remit?
Initially, when I started with England, there wasn't anything in that space for the women's team. So it was for me working out what is my role. If I kind of look at it now, I think it's anything from looking at the training of the players, the training programs they do, the monitoring those trainer loads. Back in the day, just from observations or heart rates. Now it's GPS and more advanced technology. I know Bryce Kavanagh at the FA talks about being kind of expert generalists. So it's almost you have to be an expert in every single area of sports science. So the nutrition, the recovery, the hydration, the training programs, the strength in the gym, the conditioning on the pitch. For me, it's anything that has an impact on the physical performance of the player. You link him now very closely, as we did back then, with the medical team in terms of return to play and really work tight as a multidisciplinary team. We've got a performance psychologist at England, so it's that tight team of the medical, the performance psychology, and the sports science, the physical performance that work together around that kind of support team of the players. So I also feel like within that you have to, just know how every player operates and acts and reacts. And, there's many times throughout a tournament where, you've got 23 players in a tournament and only 11 players are going to be on the pitch at any one time. And, there's going to be bumps in that road. And for me, I think one thing I feel like I've always been good at is detecting how players are feeling and their kind of emotional state and either giving them a pep up if that's what they need or giving them a bit of a kick up the backside if that's how they react. So I think that is a big thing, especially when you're in a tournament and you're 50, 60 days on the road together. I think sensing how players and staff actually are going to be and how they're doing kind of mentally, which obviously is a big overlap into the performance psychology realm. So it's just kind of a multitude of different skills along a continuum of support to the players.
And does sports psychology sit within your remit or is it a separate department that you work with?
At the FA, it's kind of multidisciplinary, so it sits with us.
Right.
So it's kind of that type medical, performance psychology, sports science, and that side are kind of the support team around.
And had you played football? You mentioned obviously not completing all of your lectures because you were playing football, but had football been a part of your life? So was it always going to be football for you in terms of that career path?
I don't think I specifically went after football. Growing up in the street, I was a tomboy. Probably at the time, I didn't even notice that I was the only female out there. I was the only girl out there playing football from morning till nighttime with the boys. But then one thing I think that became more and more apparent was that the boys could go off and play for a team, but for me there was never that platform. And my mum actually called a local radio station when I was about 14 to say, I've got a daughter who absolutely just loves playing football. Like, can anybody tell me if there's any teams in the Northeast? And the club that called up was in Whitley Bay, which, if you drive is 40 minutes. On a bus it's 2 hours. And, I'm a 14-year-old schoolgirl. My
Yeah.
mum was working full time. So I kind of tried it for a bit. And also they would play the matches on a Sunday and they could be, anywhere in the country. So I kind of tried it for a bit, but then it was just impossible on a school night to get there and get back. And it was with grown women. And, I think that was hard as well. So I didn't then play structured until I went to university at Nottingham. When I got to Manchester Met, we had a really strong team, and myself and a couple of other friends set up a second team. So we would then run, if you like, the reserve team and go off and play matches when the first team also played. So yeah, and then I've played for some regional teams, and at times had to join in. Used to play. She probably laughs and had to do all my running. Sometimes had to play centre back with Casey Stoney. In some of the early England camps when I was a bit more mobile than I am right now. So yeah, I can. If somebody plays the ball directly to my left foot, I can play a pass off. But I'm not as mobile as I used to be.
And you spent 9 years as a head of sports science for the England team before you went off to the US. So, in terms of that, across that time, how did the sports science support change at the FA?
Yeah, I think some of it was the evolution of sports science anyway, in sport, in football. And then I think some of it just the advancement of technology, where initially it was no heart rate monitoring or no physiological monitoring. But then as tools became available towards the end of my time with the FA, like the GPS, the tracking systems where you can get the distance and speed metrics of players became more available. There was also more kind of online monitoring systems, athlete wellness kind of monitoring platforms. So again, I think initially, and if you think 20 years ago, the women's game in England, it wasn't professionalized as it is today. So players were pretty much, when I first started working full time, training with the clubs once or twice a week and playing on a weekend. And then we started having them do conditioning programs, when they got home from work. Vicky Exley, who was a post person, would do a round at 5 in the morning, and then she'd finish at 11 and do a workout. And you had others who were teachers, and they'd do their teaching day and then do their session. Hope Powell was amazing at challenging the board and getting more funding for the women's team, and eventually got the players on a bit of a centralized contract, which meant some of them could reduce their working hours. We could also support them more. So it was a very tight system around the team. I think we just kind of made big strides in that sense.
And was women's football ahead of other women's sports in terms of its approach to sports science at that time, do you think?
I do feel like I was probably one of the first full-time sports scientists to be employed for kind of a women's sport. Again, if I
Yeah.
think back then, I don't think I was aware of any other female sports that actually had full-time sports science support. And, a lot of my early mentors were kind of male practitioners working in the male game because there wasn't any females kind of doing similar. It's interesting because you look back and no, there wasn't, but you didn't question it at the time. A bit like growing up playing football, I didn't question why there was no other girls playing because you just went out and played. And yeah, so it wasn't something that you actually kind of perceived or seen.
And how did you come to be high performance manager for the US women's national soccer team?
Yeah, it was interesting. Kind of in the last year, I was at the FA the first time. I got a random email from Pia Sundhage, who was the head coach for the US team at the time. It was just an email to say, we've never had a full time fitness coach, which is kind of how they called it, with the US team. Would you be interested? Very random on a personal email address. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, again, at that time, the US by far were ranked the number one team in the world. Again, that group who I spoke about where we did at Worcester, when we did the sports science research, the three of us went out to America and had a holiday for a couple of weeks, and actually were very, very fortunate to get tickets to go to the 1999 Women's World Cup final at the Rose
Wow.
Bowl. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was amazing. Like, again, I
That
think back and
amazing
I get
game.
chills. Yeah. I get chills just thinking, oh my goodness, I was actually there. I'd also, I was just so passionate about the women's game. Like, I would videotape all of the World Cup matches because they were actually on TV or on Eurosport, I think. And I would go back and I did kind of a bit of an analysis study on goals scored, where there were goals coming from and things like that. So, I'd always had a passion. I knew who Mia Hamm was and Julie Foudy and Michelle Akers, and just absolutely loved watching the US team whenever there was an opportunity. So then, she approached me and I replied. I was like, yes, would definitely be interested, would like to hear more, but I'm also committed to a role and I'm not actively looking. And then every day I would check my email and there'd be no reply, no reply. And I told Pia about this afterwards. And then a month later, I would get a reply from Pia and it would be like, we're still discussing it internally. And so I would reply the same day or maybe it's a day later, try not to be too eager. This kind of went on for about 12 months and then
Wow, okay. I
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
realise.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then eventually she said, "We're ready to kind of start moving forward. We've got a match in Germany. Would you be interested in coming to meet us? And, we can kind of meet and have a discussion." And I was like, "Absolutely." But, at this stage now, I want to let Hope know because, Hope and I had worked very closely together. I was very committed to what we were doing and I didn't want to be disrespectful to her or the England team. So I told Hope and I said I was going for a visit. There was by no way, had I signed or accepted anything or talked anything actually about the job. Went out to the game in Germany. And also at that time, some of our players, Karen Carney, Alex Scott, Kelly Smith, were playing in the US in the old Wooster, I think it was, or um, the WPS, the Women's Professional
Yeah.
Soccer League. So I went out, and of course, some of their teammates are in the US team. So I literally have arrived, and then Alex Scott's messaging me, you're with the US team, and I was like, oh no. So kind of went out, spent a few days, observed. Obviously that team achieved incredible. They were dominating, they number one team in the world. Their legacy, everything they did athletically, physically dominant. But, I watched and I was like, they don't do this bit of what we do sports science, whether it's monitoring training or, you look at the nutrition they have throughout the day and maybe it's not as customized or as strict as what we might have in terms of carbs, proteins. So straight away I was like, oh wow, like, imagine if you could add those bits to what that team are already successful in doing. And so just spent a few days there, spoke to Pierre a little bit, and then flew back to England and got on with my job because, as well, obviously, that summer 2009, with England, we got to the final of the European Championships, obviously, kind of got beat quite heavily off Germany, but it had been an amazing experience. It was a marker of how far we had come, but still how far we had to go. And then after that visit, probably about a month later, I think they made an offer and I spoke it through with Hope. We had many conversations about it. And, eventually I felt two things. I felt one, I was, excited without being disrespectful to England and my home nation. And the other side was, with England, I felt like I'd been there 9.5, almost 10 years. And, you felt like some of it, your process had maybe become a bit stale. And, was it good actually for the players in England to get a new voice, new impetus? So, combination of both of those. And I remember I spoke to my dad about it and he asked about the salary and it was quite a bit lower than what I was on with England. And he just went, okay, well, just tell him you're not going. And I was like, I think I was like gutted, and I was like, that probably, sways my final decision that I will accept it. So I did accept it, and then we had a camp in La Manga, which was my last camp with the England team. And funny, the two Scots, we always used to speak about Scott, Scott, and Scott. So Alex and Jill had this quiz, which again I found something about that recently. So we had a quiz. It was kind of a bit emotional that last day, and then I left that camp and kind of flew off to the US with a couple of bags and that was it.
Wow.
Kind of my journey began.
And did you have family or anybody out there, any contacts and connections at the time?
No, I literally kind of went with two bags, one full with research papers and books that I thought I might need to read, and another with some clothes. And yeah, just kind of headed off and literally landed, spent a night in a hotel, and the GM of the team picked me up the next day and we headed off down to San Diego. We had our first camp. Then it was like, yeah, you were just off.
You're in. And you obviously work with you mentioned some of the big confident characters in US women's soccer. So the likes of Abby Wambach and Hope Solo, Alex Morgan, Megan Rapinoe now. How do you personally deal with players that might feel they know best? And I guess when you were coming in from overseas as a new person in their mix, how did that work out?
I'm not going to lie, that first camp, I was pretty nervous because, not that I'd ever been in awe of the players, but I was maybe in awe of what they'd achieved. And so I remember the first camp, Pia said, do you want to just do a bit of an introduction in terms of what you might bring to this program? So kind of spent hours on doing this presentation, talking about sports science and monitoring their training, making it more scientific and looking at nutrition and menus and looking at their recovery and adding things in there and then what we might do in the training. And, presenting it to them, and you see some of their faces, and some of them are skeptical. And the other thing I introduced was hydration monitoring. So where they would, pee in a cup and bring it, and you pour it in and test it and give them a score there and then. And after the first day, I'm stood in the bathroom in the hotel, and they're bringing the pee cup, I pour it, tell them the score, say hydrated, not hydrated, what you should drink or try and do. And Abby comes along, does it, tell her a score, and she says, "Okay, what do I do with this cup now?" And I said, swill it out, dry it, wash it, have it ready for the next day. And she's like, what do you mean the next day? And she's like, "How long are we doing this for?" And I said, "Well, every day for the rest of the time I'm here." And she went, oh, like probably swore a little bit, cursed a little bit, and then just said, "Okay." And, I think her and Christy Rampone, who made that comment about the secret of this kind of secret sauce kind of thing, were two of my biggest advocates. And at that time, they both achieved Olympics. Christy at that time had won the World Cup. She'd been part of the squad in 1999. And, they could have said, like, "No, we're good. We don't need to do that." But Christy was, and Abby at times said, she hated me but loved me, because she hated some of the gym work. She hated some of the recovery bits, but did it because she felt the benefit. And Christy bought into absolutely every bit of it. And, I'm still in touch with Christy now. And I think getting their buy-in was immense, because then the younger players seen that and they actually followed them. And, that helped me to then start to kind of influence and introduce some of those methods.
And the US clearly has a very different structure in terms of the collegiate system that feeds
Yeah.
into the national team, and a bigger population, obviously. Do you think that will always put them at a huge advantage in terms of global sport?
I think it's interesting. I think obviously the big thing is the Title IX, and that match funding at colleges, where anything that funding on the men's side goes into the women's side. So I think with that, given that American football obviously is so big on the men's side, then that means there is so many women's soccer programs in the US because of that match funding. So they'll always have that in those numbers. But I think what is interesting of late, and Mallory Pugh was the first one to kind of start this process in 2016, when she started at UCLA, and it was a big decision for her. Should I go there? She'd also had a bit of a snippet around the US senior team. And she kind of was a bit of a star at the start of 2016. And Nike made her the poster model that year. And she started at UCLA, and I think fast realized the standard of that was night and day to the US women's national team. So she then made the decision to leave college and turn professional. And I think since then you've had a few players, Tiana Davidson, Macario, who's just pulled out and gone to Lyon, which is the first of that kind. I think you've now got Sophia Smith. You've now got more of those players who are foregoing college and actually going pro straight away, because I guess now there's more funding, there's more opportunity to earn a better salary earlier on. But I think you can also commit to a university and go back at a later date. And I think the other piece now, they see the standard of the pro game and senior women's football worldwide, and realize that actually college level isn't going to prepare you for that. And again, I think when I started with US soccer back in 2010, we didn't have those young players in the squad. They'd finished college. We didn't really have college age players in the squad. They'd come out and were all in the Women's Pro League already. And probably in my time there, Morgan Bryan in 2014 was probably the first younger player who was still in college, who I then kind of worked with a US team. Other than that, they were all actually in the Pro League. So again, I think that is a bit of a different one, but I do think that model is now evolving, because more players now are forgoing the college system and actually going pro. And the other thing, US Soccer owned and pretty much ran the Women's Pro League over there. And I think that is changing kind of a little bit. And I think NWSL and maybe is going to take that over a little bit more. So, again, I think there's a little bit of negotiation around that, and how that looks, and maybe what impact that does have on the women's national team players as well.
Interesting times ahead, isn't it? And you obviously are just going to skirt over this, won 2 World Cups and an Olympic gold with the US women's team. So why did it feel the right time to move back to the UK?
I think a combination. I think, when you're working in international football, I think you probably always look at every big tournament as a time to just assess where you're at and, what you're doing. In that job out there, with travel with the US team and then also my role with the sports science support program of the league, I'd probably be on the road for at least 150 days a year. And so I
Wow.
think the toil of that, like, I think the last 12 months is the least I've traveled. Well, not traveled anywhere, but
Any of us, yeah.
yeah, for 20 years. And, I'm not jet lagged. Whereas, for 10 years in the US, you were constantly traveling around time zones and, probably in a state of fatigue and jet lag. So I think there was a little bit of that. I did feel after that tournament a bit physically, mentally fatigued. Obviously, there was a coaching transition. So Jill had already decided to leave. There was also a change in some of the organizational structure. So they brought in a general manager for the first time. I was starting to evaluate what I wanted to do. I'd kind of done the role where I'd been called anything from a fitness coach, sports scientist to performance coach, high performance manager for the women's team. I solely worked with the senior team, didn't really ever touch the pathway. And so one thing I'd said was, I'm interested in the pathway and, maybe it's a bigger role, more of a development role, maybe it's more less time on the grass. And it was just apparent that role wasn't there. So I think that was part of it. I spoke about that. And then at the same time that the role at the FA came up, I was approached a little bit about that. Also family, like my 9, 10 years in the US, you miss so many events, whether you're in sport anyway, being the other side of the country. My dad had passed away in 2012 when I'd been in Olympic qualifying. My mom used to come out 2 or 3 times a year and she'd love it because of the sun. But as my schedule got busier and busier, there was less windows for her to come out. And my friends in England, I wasn't seeing them. And, there was a tug of imagine kind of working with England again, your home nation. And
Mm.
so I think it was a combination of all of that. But, it was also the hardest decision of my life so far because those players like were my family for 9, 10 years. You mentioned Megan Rapinoe, and I'd worked with her from the day one of my camp, and she was on that day one of camp, and
Uh,
she was rehabbing that camp because she was sick and there was stuff going on. So I was there day one.
I heard about her crying as she was asked about you leaving.
Well, we both did when I called her. Like when I called her to kind of let her know, kind of we both did because it was emotional. Even now it still feels a bit emotional. And straight after I'd made the decision, a couple of players tried to reach out, and I was still emotional at that point. And I
Yeah.
couldn't speak to them, and I ended up kind of sending an email, like an individual email to every single player, and then a card just to follow up because I did feel so kind of close and like a family with them.
And was there a sense of almost unfinished business to the players that you worked with in those early years of your career, like Steph Houghton, who are now at the top of the game? Great to have catch them at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my one regret was, and I still tell her this, was Karen Carney retired
Oh, yeah.
12 months too early for me. And I always tell her that because she's a legend, and I know her from day one of being 14 and coming to Lilleshall. But yeah, because obviously in the kind of last few years, the England would come out for the She Believes tournament. So
Yeah, yeah.
I'd either always see the players on the pitch after we played, or as they were finishing their game and they would come off the pitch, I would be coming on to set up for the warm up for the US team. So, like Steph, Jill, Karen, especially Carly Telford, Karen Bargy, it would be a quick hug and, hey, how are you doing? And Steph, bless her, is such an amazing person, and everything she's achieved as an individual and as a player, would always hug me. Hey, legend, how are you doing when you're coming back? Um, so, it was. I still kind of kept in touch now and again. If you've seen them do something, I'd drop a message. And yeah, absolutely. I think it was a combination of it would be great to work with those players again and help them a bit more on their journey. And yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the role you have now with England, and I guess how much impact you've been able to make this year in this strange year that we're in now, really?
Yeah, so role I came in with was as physical performance manager. Again, it's kind of the sports science side, working very closely with the medical, the performance psychology around the team. But in terms of the role, I think initially it was, meeting the players, making connections with the clubs, which for me is a massive part of this role. Again, with Phil, it was coming in, working with him, getting to know the other staff. Me and him last January were going to clubs. He was introducing me, and then I would connect with the sports science fitness staff in the clubs, starting those communications. Obviously, She Believes last year was my first tournament and first and last competitive matches so far. before we actually left England for She Believes, our head of medical gave us some information about this virus that had come up, COVID. Kind of the general messaging globally and from the FA was, it's something that's been flagged, but it's not deemed to be anything too serious. So we're still good to travel. So we go to Florida, play in Florida, and then there's reports in Florida, there's outbreaks, and then we go to New York, play there. Then as we're leaving New York, there's outbreaks in New York. Then we go to Dallas, play there, similar, and then we're flying back. And you're on the flight and you start reading a bit more news, and it's like, oh wow, this looks like it's starting to get bigger than it is. So as we land in Heathrow and you see the headlines on newspapers and it starts talking about lockdown, and actually messaged all of the players and actually staff saying, you might want to get on Amazon and buy yourself a medicine ball, a kettlebell, a pair of dumbbells, and
Yeah.
some basic fitness equipment. And I actually did that myself, and I still have them in the back garden because I said it looks like we're going into lockdown, and then by the Monday we're in lockdown. So initially it was like, how are we going to work together? And what we then did a real deep debrief of the She Believes, some of the physical data, the technical, tactical. We spent a lot of time delivering that to clubs as a whole, clubs individually, then individual players with clubs spoke about some of their physical data. So kind of did a lot of that during that time. Then during the longer lockdown, I kind of worked with some players, Lucy Bronze, Alex Greenwood, Nikit Paris would program for those players. And then some of our players who were in college, so Lisa Russo, Anna Patton, Lotta Moy were a few who'd come back from college, so we're programming for them over the summer. And then obviously we've been fortunate to have 3 camps last year, but again it was under the strict guidance of our COVID protocols at the FA, our COVID officers, and having in-house matches and starting to physically profile and test the players, set them some benchmark standards of where we need to get them to, educate them, keep working with the clubs to say, this is where our players are at, looking at what are the physical match demands for England, what are the physical match demands for club. And, what we're seeing right now is the demands for England at times can be 40, 50% higher than a WSL match.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we then look at, okay, well, where are our, what are the physical fitness levels of our players? And again, where are they compared to some of the best players in the world? How can we work with you to maybe give the players some extras in the week to make sure they're kind of trending towards where we need them?
It's good for the clubs, then, isn't it? Actually, if you're getting their fitness levels of their players up and working with them, that's got to be better for the clubs in the WSL as well in terms of their performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, for me, if we push up those levels, it's going to push up, kind of the standard and level of the clubs. So, and again, obviously the influx of some of the, other
US.
international players, but US, but Pernille Harder and some of the other players kind of worldwide. Some of your Australian players are Sam Kerr. I
Yeah.
think the influx of those players, for me, I think we already see our game in England as being a bit faster than it has been previous. So I'm sure those demands are higher and it's, continually evolving. And I think the other piece, we've done some work around female health and menstrual cycle, some basic education building on previous work that our team doctor had done, some of the education monitoring that him and medical team had done previously. Again, giving players some kind of individual focus and support and trying to reduce severity of menstrual cycle symptoms. And with that, kind of improve their recovery and ultimately then help them improve performance. So really just looking at each player as an individual, but we're absolutely not programming for the players. It's absolutely in collaboration with the clubs to then keep pushing those players up. And like you say, it's a benefit for the club, but then, in 4 months' time when we're in final preparations for Tokyo Olympics, we're then in a better position and our players are physically ready for international football and international tournament football and an Olympics, which is probably the most demanding world tournament ever because it's 6 matches in 17 days in, challenging heat humidity conditions.
And the overarching aim of the FA, they stated, was for the Lionesses to win a major championships by 2023, which seems like it's just around the corner now. So
Yeah.
I guess how confident do you feel about this? And second question really, but you've been described as England's secret weapon. So I imagine that must bring huge pressure to deliver on that stage too for you.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's, I think anybody can write anything in the media, but, what I know is that it's a team support and a team approach, and no one person in the team behind the team is any more important than anybody else or has a bigger role than anybody else, from our media, commercial communications team, equipment, logistics, medical, performance psychology, the video technology, and then the physical performance, our security. Every single person has a role at any moment in time. So yes, I read those things, but I just keep my head down and do my job, and I'm one part of the whole jigsaw. We have a short term, but we have a long term vision, and short term is Tokyo, medium term is Euros, and longer term is World Cup, and then there's a long term beyond that. So, I think it's looking at what is achievable for this summer, because if there's 100 things you think can improve performance, you're not going to achieve everything by the summer. So what can you prioritize for this summer, and actually what can maybe be running in the background that can actually come in and be beneficial for next summer? Because again, you've got players who really aren't going to make this summer, but can be in chance for next year, and actually a probably stronger chance for 2023.
I loved hearing that you also got a gold medal when the team won the World Cup. So, do you feel that the backroom staff get enough recognition for the role they play?
I don't think any of us as support staff do it for that exposure. Like, I feel like for me, if ever I do, an interview like this, it's more about raising the profile of women and females working in sport in a role other than a participant. As a girl growing up, as I said at the start, I didn't see women working in sport, and probably on the TV, I rarely seen women competing in sport. I think now, the Tokyo Olympics for the first time was going to be the closest balance of gender, in terms of, I think it's 48.8% female participation. But if you look at, say, the coaches, I'm sure there's an imbalance male female. If you look at practitioners, and again, if you look in football, probably female practitioners in the women's game, there's probably an imbalance. If you look at women practitioners or coaches in the men's game, there's an even bigger imbalance. But I think as well, for me, like, if we look at that gender balance, like, I've been asked at times, do you want to work in the men's game? And I'm really passionate about women's football, about women's sport, and I don't see that actually moving to the men's game as a step up from what I'm doing. And I think sometimes there is that ignorant thought that, a role in the men's game is higher than the women's. Like, I was asked recently about Jill, who'd obviously won the two World Cup medals, and might she be interested in a reserve team role on a men's team? And I was like, I'm not sure. Respectfully, I would ask her that question. Like, I don't see that as being a step up for Jill, like,
Mm.
even if it is on the men's side. So for me, it's just about the exposure piece of, if a girl in school can pick up something and see me or anybody as a female working in a role other than a participant in sport, I think that's the piece for me that makes me happy and satisfied at what I'm doing, not really that Dawn Scott or the physio or the head of communications has been the golden nugget to the team winning, because again, it's not about any one individual.
And the Game Changers podcast is all about sharing stories of trailblazing women in sport. And as you pointed out, well, we're now in our 7th series, and you're my first sports scientist that I've spoken to. So I guess, what is the gender balance like in sports science today?
Again, still very heavily weighed towards male practitioners. Again, if I look at the, say, WSL as an example, in terms of which clubs have got female sports scientists, I'd probably say it's maybe a third or less in the WSL are female. I think one thing that we have done extremely well in England is, if you look at WSL head coaches, there is a
Yeah.
much higher, female gender balance of head coaches. Like, you look at NWSL, and I think there's one of the 9 NWSL teams, 10 now, have got a female head coach. Whereas I think it is over half in the WSL. But yeah, you look at practitioners, and it's heavily weighed as male to female. And if you also look at female practitioners in the male game, you've got Frankie Hunter, who's at Middlesbrough. You've got Laura Bowen, who used to be on the Southampton men's side, who's actually now head of performance on the Southampton women's side. But there's very few female practitioners in men's sports. I mean, another one is Jo Clubb, who's done amazingly well. She previously was a sports scientist working with Chelsea. She's probably the first female practitioner sports scientist to actually do great things in an American sport. She went out as the Buffalo Sabres ice hockey head of performance, And then in a role there has actually kind of moved into a role now where she works with the Buffalo Bills, the NFL team, who
Oh,
recently just
wow.
got to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
semi-finals. And, she's done amazing things. Again, for me, if you're a girl in America and you see Joe advertise somewhere or Joe tweet something or something like that, then you go, that's a role I can do. I'm interested in that. I want to do that. I love American football or ice hockey. And, that's something I can do. Similarly, I think over here, I think for a girl at school to see that, I think is just the important piece.
And could you ever see yourself working in another sport apart from football?
I mean, never say never. I think it's hard because, for 20, 25 years of my career now, it's been football. I grew up playing it for my sins, watching season ticket holder with Newcastle. So I don't know, it's kind of been ingrained. It's my life, but, I'm always open to learning and try new things. I'm actually studying part-time for a master's in sports directorship. So I'm continuing to learn and grow myself. Like first module was leadership. So, I always want to learn and grow. Like, I don't know, maybe I just kind of feel like I get a bit bored or stale if I sit still. So I'd never say never. I think it just depends what the opportunity is rather than what the sport is and what the actual role is. I've been on the grass, on the pitch, on the field for so many years. And you always think about when do you start transitioning off the grass into more of a management leadership role. I'm happy where I am right now and yeah, just kind of seeing how that transitions. Like you just said, it's a quick 2.5 years to the World Cup, which
Yeah.
obviously we want to qualify for in Australia in 2023.
And finally, what advice would you give to any younger woman considering that role in sports science?
For me, believe in yourself. Like if you want something, it's up to you to go and achieve it. I have the mantra of like control the controllables. If it's something that you're passionate about and want to do, I think read about it, research about it, reach out to other people. I think that is far easier now with all of the different modes of social media where you can, message somebody on Twitter or Instagram and if that's something you want to do, reach out to people and I think shadow people to see is that something you do want to do. If you're at college or university studying it, I think get as much hands-on experience as you can because I think that can be the differentiating at times of having done a qualification but then actually having a bit of applied experience. I think as well, finding a role model or a mentor or a coach. Again, if that is a specific area you're interested in, is there somebody who's in that role? Whether it is a female in the role, whether it's a male in the role, whether it's a female in a male sport, a male in a female sport. Again, just finding somebody who you can work with and follow and shadow. And yeah, I think just believe in it, and drive it. Like, but you've got to drive it yourself. I think sometimes we look at are there less females in coaching or doing qualifications because there isn't the opportunity, or is there less females because they don't think they can apply or should apply? So I think it's a bit of both. I think believe in yourself, but also, be brave and apply and do it and push it and drive it because only you can drive it.
I could have talked to Dawn for another hour. What an incredible woman. Perhaps she'll let me interview her again after the Euros next year. Many of the impressive women Dawn mentions on the podcast have been previous guests on The Game Changers, so do take a listen. They include the likes of current England captain Steph Houghton, former England manager Hope Powell, and head of women's football at the FA, Sue Campbell. You can find out more about all 58 of my trailblazing guests at fearlesswomen.co.uk, and that's also where you can see more of the other work I do, including the Women's Sport Collective, a network for women working in sport. Thanks to Barclays for their ongoing support of The Game Changers, and thanks also to Sam Walker from What Goes On Media, who does a great job as executive producer of the podcast. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Game Changers or at Sue Anstiss. Next week's guest is Manisha Taylor, academy coach at QPR and the first South Asian woman to coach in the professional men's game. Having trained as a head teacher, it was a devastating mental health diagnosis for her twin brother that brought Manisha back into football. She's gone on to do so much for diversity in sport and in 2017 received an MBE in recognition of her work.
I look back at myself and I think I didn't see any Indian female or male footballers. You have to then draw upon, I suppose, your intrinsic motivation that you want to be a change maker, you want to create change so that you can actually create this visibility and hope for other people.
The Game Changers. Fearless Women in Sport.